As the Minister and his party depart for other engagements this afternoon, we're not going to finish there. Rather, it's my privilege to invite the chair of our first panel, Dr. Allan Bollard, to the stage to begin that panel. You heard that Allan was previously APEC's Executive Director and a former Reserve Bank Governor. He's now Professor of Practice at Victoria University of Wellington School of Government and the Chair of the CAPES Advisory Board. Thank you, Allan.
Well, kia ora koutou. Thank you for inviting me here. I'm pleased to be able to chair this session on government initiatives. Vangelis, did I see you down there? Up here, mate. Yep, thank you. So, we're going to hear about government initiatives. When an economist looks at New Zealand and Chile, we see two small, independent, very southerly countries that are making our way in the world, and it's not always easy, and we've got big noisy neighbours, and when we find that New Zealand, and at least the southern part of Chile, what do we produce? It's kiwi fruit, it's dairying, it's meat, it's radiata pine, it's salmon, it's wine, it's apples. We know we've got a lot in common, and sometimes that's there for cooperation and sometimes for competition. More than that, I look back to when I was running Treasury in the 1990s, and we were trying to work out an appropriate way for setting up institutions for fiscal stability, all the things that we now take for granted. Where did we go? We went to Santiago to talk to some of the quite famous economists who were there, who at the time were putting Chile in the front of the reforms around fiscal initiatives. 10 years after that, when I was running the Reserve Bank, Chile was looking at monetary policy. Where did they look? They came across to see us in Wellington to follow the Reserve Bank Act and the way that the Reserve Bank of New Zealand was running monetary policy. When it came to us putting in place a revamped currency and new coinage, where did we go? We went across to Chile because they had just done exactly the same thing, and they were happy to tell us, frankly, about what went well and what to look out for in all of this. It's a close set of ad hoc but very close relationships that we've had in the economic area. Now, we're really pleased in this panel to be able to talk about government initiatives and in a more broader sense, and it's my big pleasure to chair this session and to be able to introduce our panellists. So we will have coming online the Right Honourable Helen Clark, who is former Prime Minister of New Zealand and former head of the United Nations Development Programme in New York. Welcome, Helen.
Greetings.
We also have online Javiera Vicedo, who's Director of Engagement for Latin America for Education New Zealand. Welcome, Javiera. And very pleased to have on the platform with me Vangelis Vitalis, Deputy Secretary from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade and Head of the Trade and Economics Group, and the person who's had a huge experience in working out trade negotiations in this region. So I'm going to ask Helen to start off with a question, and then we'll take it through from there from the panel. So Helen, you're known to have had a deep and long engagement and personal interest in Chile. When did that start? Why were you so interested? How did all that begin? Thanks.
Well, I have to say it didn't start with dairy, forestry and fish. It started because I was very interested in the political developments in Chile, and obviously the election of Salvador Allende as the first ever president from the left in 1970. But of course, hard on the heels of that, and around a year after New Zealand opened the embassy, there was the devastating coup d'etat with then the executions, torture, the detentions of so many people who the dictatorship saw as a threat. And for decades it left a stain on the beautiful image of the Esmeralda, which used to come to New Zealand before those times as a training ship for the Chilean Navy, but was used as a ship of torture. So many memories of political developments going back to that time. In Allende's coalition was a party in the Social Democratic International of parties, the Socialist International. So I met Chileans through that and through its youth movement as well. And I first got to meet Ricardo Lagos, who was the next president from the left to be elected just just after I became PM. I met him in the early 90s at a gathering of social democratic parties, and we kept in touch. I think back to those early years, there were phenomenal films like the movie Missing, which told the story of a young American who was swept up in the detentions and disappeared, killed by the junta. I think of the wonderful book by Joan Yara, who was the widow of Victor Yara, the folk singer who was murdered by the dictatorship. So lots of memories really coming from my intense interest in the politics of the country at the time, and then looking at the pathway back to democracy, the 1988 referendum and everything that unfolded from them, and then democratic presidents began coming to New Zealand again.
You basically launched a Latin American strategy for New Zealand in 1999 when you became Prime Minister, and you attended President Lagos's inauguration. So what were you looking to achieve from that, and what do you think the main achievements actually have been in bilateral relationships during your time as Prime Minister?
I remember getting an invitation through the Chilean Secretary General of the Socialist International asking me, when I was a very new Prime Minister, would I come to Ricardo Lagos's inauguration? And I was a bit nervous about raising it because I was new in office, and of course all politics is local really. But when I raised it, Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade was very keen, because they said, we have this Latin American strategy, we'd love to road test it, and the obvious place to do this would be at the inauguration. And you have the opportunity to meet with other presidents in the region, which was, of course, true, both formally and informally, bilaterals, official functions associated with the inauguration and so on. That was then followed up, having road tested the strategy at the inauguration, with the 5-country visit where I took a trade delegation, and Māori cultural delegation came with us. And we went to Mexico, Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil. So a lot goes back to that first meeting at the inauguration. I think looking back at the achievements which came out of that, obviously the Trans-Pacific Partnership had its roots in conversations at APEC between me, Ricardo Lagos, the President of Chile, and Goh Chok Tong, the Prime Minister of Singapore. That's where the deal was done. And actually signed late 2006 when I went to the next Chilean inauguration for Michelle Bachelet. I think if I look back at the press statement made at the time that I went to, was planning to go to Chile again for an inauguration, we were able to look at very positive developments in trade and investment. We had a strategic alliance signed between NZTE and Chile's Corfu, the Economic Development Agency, which had the purpose of promoting investment by New Zealand into Chilean sectors. We also had a science agreement signed at that time to hold a colloquium and look at opportunities for joint research proposals. The Working Holiday Scheme was signed in my time by Phil Goff as Foreign Minister. That was incredibly popular. I recall the places that all used to go on the first day when it opened up. So all of this was good, and of course Chris Hipkins has canvassed the education developments, a lot of which go back to those times as well. So I think looking back, I think part of my legacy is to put Chile firmly on the map of a wider range of New Zealanders, and to support the Kiwi businesses that were doing business in Chile, including through investment. There was also the very important cultural links between Māori and the people Rapa Nui, and I recall some very poignant moments of encounters between the two, particularly on our 2001 visit with the Māori delegation as well. Back to you, Allan.
Yeah, well, thank you. Well, so Vangelis, when Helen Clark floats into Santiago and signs something with President Lagos or Michelle Bachelet, does it just happen like that? How do these trade negotiations actually come about? You've visited Chile a lot of times, and how has that all happened in the Chile context?
It's a very daunting panel to be part of. Well, actually, I mean, what the former Prime Minister has said is exactly right. It does take the drive at the political level to drive these trade agreements, and I think what was striking about the relationship with Chile is the like-mindedness. So it was, I mean, I was part of the negotiating team for P4, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, and it was done during a period, I think, which was something like the golden weather for New Zealand trade policy. It was a period when the WTO, the Uruguay round had ended, agriculture had now been brought formally into the rules-based trading system, and this was a big deal for countries like Chile and New Zealand. And so our mind started to turn then, how do you expand and take forward those rules? Because we always had in mind, I think both Chile and New Zealand, that this golden weather was driven by three things. One was the rules-based system, how important that was. The second was that markets, particularly agricultural markets, needed to become more open. And the third was sustaining our social license at home. And so during this golden weather period, I think the P4 became a real driver. It was the first agreement to bring in labour and environment. And that was driven very much by the then Prime Minister and her counterpart in Chile. And I can vividly remember how determined those two leaders were to make sure that this agreement would be the new standard. And it's easy sometimes to forget that, but that was the new standard on for trade agreements and how we would think about trade and labour standards and trade and environment standards. So that golden weather, I think, was a real driver for us. We collaborated together very closely, as you know very well yourself, in APEC, which is that norm-building process, and the two of us working very closely together to drive the trade agenda to support that rules-based system. And then, of course, we have the Pacific Alliance, which we are very keen to be a part of. Unfortunately, and I think this is now the next part of the phase of the relationship with Chile, the golden weather for both our and Chile's trade policy really has ended. If you think about those three things I identified, the rules that we took for granted, they are certainly now under serious pressure, if not fragmenting around us. The assumption that both of us had about markets being more and more open internationally is clearly not true. We are now going in reverse. And the third thing I'd say is that the social license. I think both of us have learned some very tough lessons about the way in which we negotiate trade agreements, and both of us learned that lesson the hard way on TPP, CPTPP. The challenge that we had in New Zealand when we signed the agreement and the difficulties we had to persuade New Zealanders that this was a good agreement that we need to sign. I think Chile is going through a similar challenge now. CPTPP is now before the Senate in Chile, in fact, over the next week. We hope that will be passed. But I think the lessons that we've learned, and I've been now several times to Chile, both always to meet my counterpart, to share the lessons that we've both learned and are learning about how we run these trade agreements, how they need to be addressed, and in particular, some of the things we're trying to do in the, to build that and sustain that social license is where we've worked very closely together.
So you're still currently working with Chile on the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, the Global Trade and Gender Arrangement, the Inclusive Trade Action Group. Tell us about those, and are they a pathway forward to keep things moving in this really quite difficult Asia-Pacific world at the moment?
So, I mean, this goes, thanks, Alan. I mean, this goes back to my point about the end of the golden weather, and what is it that we should do as small countries that are trade dependent? How do we look to shore up and sustain this system that we value, but is clearly in a different, under tremendous strain and being fractured around us? And so what we tried to do when we signed CPTPP, which of course was signed in Santiago, we also announced, together with Chile and Canada, we announced a commitment that we would establish the Inclusive Trade Action Group, as you said, and in particular that we would review the CPTPP against 5 metrics. One, what does it do for our regions, the regions of New Zealand, the regions of Chile? What does it do for small and medium enterprises in our 2 countries? What does this trade agreement deliver for our Indigenous populations? What does this agreement deliver for women entrepreneurs? And what does it do on labour and environment? Is it actually helping us address some of those challenges? So the Inclusive Trade Action Group was very deliberately structured around addressing that social license question. How is it that this agreement actually can deliver? And so together, and Chile was our natural partner. And I'll never forget that in the midst of COVID, I called 2 countries and we had a regular, weekly, and then it became a daily Zoom call with 2 countries that helped us and we helped them during COVID. It was Chile and it was Singapore. The 3 of us with that long relationship, we know each other, we've known each other through Geneva, through the APEC process. I've got colleagues that are still working in the Chilean Ministry of Trade, as old as me, who were also involved in the P4 negotiation. Those relationships that we instinctively understand what it is we need to do. So the Inclusive Trade Action Group, we all understood, was a really important part of sustaining what was now a very fragile social license for trade agreements. The Global Trade and Gender Arrangement is something that came out of the Inclusive Trade Action Group and was designed to say, we understand that these trade agreements have benefits, but are we sure that they are delivering benefits, for example, for women entrepreneurs? So we know there's a gap. We know that there's a gap between women and men in export industries. How big is that gap? And what is it that a trade agreement needs to do to address that? That's what that instrument looks to do. And then finally, an observation on the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement. This is a classic small country agreement. We came together, the 3 of us, Singapore, Chile, and New Zealand. We came together, we were at another meeting in Geneva. The 3 of us sat down and said, what are we going to do about digital trade? We did not want the big economies, whether it was China, whether it was the United States, whether it was the EU, to impose these rules on us. Instead, we wanted to design an agreement that worked for small and medium enterprises, that worked for our companies. That was the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement. But we always conceived it, like P4, as an open plurilateral agreement. In other words, it was open to any country that could join and meet the standards that we were setting in this agreement. And I'm really pleased that we've got a G20 economy now very close to joining, Korea. We've just, in June, we set up 2 working parties to consider the request for accession from China, but also from Canada, so a G7 economy looking to join it as well. And this is a real attempt by the 3 of us, and Chile and New Zealand in particular, to say, we would like to be shaping and informing these rules. We do have agency as small countries, and we do want to drive the agenda out there, and we want it to reflect our interests. It is still the only digital economy agreement that specifically references SMEs, and in particular mentions the importance of Indigenous data.
Well, thank you. So we've heard a lot about trade relations and how they're being formalised and moved forward, and how in our own smaller way we can help lead the world to some better spaces and all of this as well. Let's talk about education links. So, Javiera, over the last couple of decades, education links have been an important part of these relationships. Tell us about some of the main priorities when we're dealing with Chile on these education links.
Yes, it's my pleasure to be sharing this panel with such important speakers connecting from Santiago, Chile, tonight for me. And especially what everybody has shared before, I think also education has been a bridge also between our 2 nations, separated by the Pacific Ocean, but definitely that has bring us together, and especially to get to know each other. I think that one of the key government initiatives that now we're seeing the results has been the government scholarships, now former NC8 or NCORA, but now known as Manaki scholarships. Many of students, Chilean students that went and did master's, PhD educations, probably some of them are in the room or are connecting from Chile. So, and then our teaching in our universities, they are teaching in Chilean universities and, as the minister said, in universities abroad. We are celebrating, I think, all those connections that start by exchanging culture, language, learning from each other. And I think that was an important program. We also had an important iconic agreement signed in 2008 with former Minister Foxley and former Minister Peter Hodgson, that allowed APEC Chile, for example, and there was a huge investment from the Chile government in sending master and PhD students to New Zealand that again increase the linkages into the research, allow us to connect and also helped New Zealand to develop our human capital. Definitely the Prime Minister's Scholarship established to Latin America. Even though that is still quite recent, we are seeing the strong connections allowing, in general, Kiwi students to come to Chile to learn Spanish, although our accent is not very good, Chilean Spanish. It's not the best one, but we try. But in general, allow us to, work, do internships, and to connect again with us. And as the minister was saying, we do have a strong Kiwi alumni association here in Chile, and those people now are influencing in general in all sectors. In terms of our work here, we do have the ECA that just signed. Is Chile and New Zealand is the only countries in Latin America that we do have an ECA renewal. And now we are incorporating some other themes that we didn't have in the past: diversity, equity, inclusion, indigenous linkages that has been explained before. So definitely, those linkages and strong connections, I'm only seeing that are getting bigger, and definitely we are here to keep celebrating those.
Well, thank you, Javiera. I know you're on the agenda later on this afternoon, so you'll get a chance to talk about some of that in a bit more detail. Could I go back to Helen and say, over the next decade, what would you hope we might see evolving in terms of New Zealand, Chile, and the sort of opportunities we could do together or bring forward? Have you got any vision for where that might go, not just in trade, but more generally?
I was encouraged listening to Damien O'Connor at the event celebrating this establishment of embassies in the two countries in Auckland last week, to hear about some of the work done on the digital trade relationships. So I think we need to keep upgrading the arrangements that we have with Chile for the current era of innovation, fourth industrial revolution, and so on. As Vangelis would be the best equipped to tell us, the WTO last had a round when it was called GATT, and it was the Uruguay round. This is decades ago. So GATT trade agreements, the trade agreement increasingly covers less and less of global trade. So I think in where we have strong bilateral partners, we need to be looking at how we can bring what we do together in trade into the modern age. So that's encouraging. Certainly looking forward to seeing the full flowering of the people-to-people links again as people begin to get more confidence about travelling as the pandemic kind of tapers off, although never really goes away. And I think just look to sectors across society, business, education, our cities who haven't really been on the act much with sister city type ties, indigenous ties, to really see what we can build on. There's already been some reference to the indigenous ties, and Chile has a particular interest in New Zealand's historical reconciliation processes and the treaty. They grapple with these issues, and we're on a journey. They're on a journey, but there are experiences to share. So I think in the multilateral forum, Vangelis is absolutely right. It's not a great time in the trade space. On the other hand, we have a new, very energetic head of World Trade Organization, and countries like Chile and New Zealand, which can help her discharge her mandate to try and get another round. Very, very helpful. And then there's all the other things we work on multilaterally, and let's not forget, the importance of those. Also, Antarctica. So it's kind of building on what we've done, but looking for new opportunities to push further.
Thanks. Vangelis, what's realistic out of that list, do you think?
Everything. But I mean, but in all seriousness, I do think that it is a case of trying to imagine what the future looks like and really thinking about how that is. And with a partner like Chile, everything really is possible. I mean, what's the line from Pablo Neruda about if you don't climb the mountain, you don't see the view. And I think that is a really important thing that Chile and New Zealand together. There's a mountain out there now. I mean, to use a bit of a cliche, there is a jungle growing back internationally, and we are now entering a perfect storm of really big challenges. And I think the two of us working together are going to be critical to shoring up and sustaining that system, just because we both believe in the way in which that system has reinforced and sustained our own economies and delivered for our people. So in terms of the way ahead, what are the big things we could work on? Look, clearly expansion of the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement. Our vision definitely does not stop at just one G7 economy. We'd like others to join. And certainly the inclusive trade action work is going to be really important. The other big initiative that New Zealand had alongside our APEC year last year was an Indigenous Partnership Economic Trade and Cooperation Arrangement, the unwieldy acronym of IPECTCA, a classic MFAT one. We put that on the table. It was just during the presidential election in Chile, so it wasn't an ideal time, but we really hope that Chile can be a partner in that. That is a really important sort of co-partnership with Indigenous populations, Maori on our side, and on Chile's side. The other partners in it, of course, are Canada, Australia, and Chinese Taipei. So it is a really interesting agreement that we would like to see being built out. But it is a case of these open plurilateral agreements becoming these important building blocks to sustain the system and making sure that they're not stumbling blocks. There's no better partner than Chile on this, and the agility with which we can move together really is the thing that we really want to work together with, and the agency that the two of us have, and ensuring that we have so that the system isn't imposed on us, but we are able to drive that agenda as much as we can, and you always can do that better. And Chile, for me, Chile has been absolutely critical partner all through my career, and I just see that continuing out into the future, not just in these structural arrangements, but all of the people-to-people links people have talked about.
Thanks, Vangelis. Javier, I noticed you nodding vigorously when Helen Clark was talking about Indigenous connections. Any thoughts from your side on that? What are the Indigenous connections? Is there enough commonality to really make something of that?
Well, definitely. There is our Rapa Nui community and Maori community. They consider themselves as cousins. And as the Ambassador Linda Tepuri mentioned in her message, the recent delegation of the speakers, in every meeting, the linkage between our Indigenous community was highlighted there. We've been also having delegations, for example, from Te Kahuia Mokura in 2019 on revitalization of Indigenous languages. And Chile, in our process, in the constitutional process and then in the reform, has been looking New Zealand as a role model. And one of the key themes in all those conversations has been academic exchange, educational exchange, and how we can get to know how New Zealand did it in the first place, but also how New Zealand can accompany Chile in that process, in the process of dialogue and conversations. For example, next month, we're going to have here a delegation from academics from Te Wānanga or Aotearoa, and they're going to be visiting different communities here. And it's amazing when we accompany this journey and we put our Indigenous communities together, amazing things happen. And sometimes language is not a barrier there anymore. So again, I think definitely there are much more similarities. we both want to know from each other. I think reciprocity is key here in this journey. And I think, you know, in general, we are very strong partners, and from that definitely that linkages can also get bigger and bigger.
Thank you. Just to close, Helen, actually we went through university together, and my memory of in the holidays I used to go off and work on farms to milk cows to earn some money. But I've got a feeling you went off to Latin America at various times doing various things. When you look back from that time till now, and of course that's not just Chile, but do you see Chile as an interesting window into other stuff through Latin America? How did that all impact the way you think about it and where we might go?
I didn't get to travel to Chile privately until January '89, and then I went back 2 years later because I loved Chile and Patagonia so much in 1991 and took my parents even there. But what struck me at that time, and that was very much a time of transition, the referendum being held leading up to the first elections when President Allan was constitutionally elected president. The country and the countryside was still very, very underdeveloped. So you just couldn't avoid seeing the opportunities for New Zealand agricultural investment, New Zealand agri-tech and innovation in that economy. I still think of looking out the window of a little two-star hotel in Puerto Montt one morning and seeing a donkey or a mule carrying along a cart with cream cans on it. Brought me back to the really much earlier years of my childhood. So I think it's just come such a long way. I was able to travel also to Argentina in the mid 1980s when President Alfonsín was president, and again you saw opportunity for New Zealand. We had a similar agricultural basis to the Southern Cone countries, but we were so much more advanced because the Kiwi farmer has been so adaptive for so long with technology and innovation. So that's what struck me, that really big opportunity for us.
Thanks, Helen. Well, that's a great way for us to end this panel on government initiatives. Can you join me in thanking our panellists? Thank you very much.